Hello and welcome. This is a special broadcast on Times Now as India marks Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav. Two people who are with me in the studio are doing their bit to bring out the tales of unsung heroes of India. You've all heard about the 1857 rebellion, but very little is written and known about the Santhal War of 1855. This book, Sido Kanhu by Tuhin A Sinha and Clark Prasad, talks about that, and we have the authors here in our studio to talk about it. Welcome both of you, Tuhin A Sinha, Clark Prasad, to Times Now. Tuhin, let me begin by asking you, why did you choose to write about Sido Kanhu?
Well, good evening, Pranesh. As you know, we are celebrating Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav. And this year, more specifically, we are also observing Mera Mati Meri Mera Desh, which obviously means that we need to kind of invoke the sacrifice of all those people whose sacrifice in our freedom struggle has gone unnoticed. But more importantly, you know, there is a larger narrative that this book seeks to achieve. And call it an eerie coincidence. You know, our recording is happening at a time when the person who has denigrated Savarkar day in and day out is carrying on his cringe fest in Parliament, speaking on the no confidence motion. I'm talking about Rahul Gandhi. Look at the way he denigrated Savarkar day in and day out. So when I talk about our subaltern freedom movement, that goes many steps ahead to establish the fact that our freedom movement is not the fiefdom of any one ideology, of any one party. Our subaltern freedom movement, the tribal freedom movement, started more than 100 years before the formation of the Congress party. It dates back to, 1784, when Tilka Majhi led a revolution in the area of present-day Bhagalpur. By the start of the 19th century, simultaneous tribal movements were reported from all parts of the country. That included U. Tirot Singh, an unknown freedom fighter in Meghalaya. And the book that we are currently talking about is about a revolution in the present-day area of Santhal. When I talk of Santhal, obviously all of that was a part of the erstwhile Bengal province. But this revolution took place between the areas of Bhagalpur in present-day Bihar, the current districts of Rajmahal, Dumka and Godda, the area of Nishikant Dubey in Jharkhand, and to a wide stretch in Bengal, which included Malda and Murshidabad. 50,000 people participated in it, 10,000 people were killed, and all of it was led in a very cooperative, in a very, community-led style by one family, the brave Murmu family, 4 brothers, 2 sisters, Sido Kanhu, Chand, Bhairav, and 2 sisters, Phulo, Jano, and all of them were married and with families. So imagine the kind of sacrifice they did by leaving their familial responsibilities, by leaving their other responsibilities and leading this revolution, which took place over a period of 8 to 9 months. So that is why the story becomes so relevant.
Now, Clark, allow me to bring you in. I've had some time to go through the book, and correct me if I'm wrong. Why have you chosen to have a dramatized recreational approach instead of a straight historical non-fictional narrative?
Yeah, because we have to see storytelling, and as humans, humans are the original storytellers of the planet. Now, many centuries ago, eons ago, we had early man painting on, they're telling their story through the walls. Now, if you have a non-fiction book with details, data, it'll be boring. The idea out here is to have a wider reach and try to bring in the emotions of the people on the ground that time. Because imagine traveling back to 1855. When we say 1857, we'll see a lot of reports, news, details here, there, and in a city. But what would happen in a jungle? What would happen in the village? What would happen to the places which really mattered? 1855.
Right.
So what used to go in the mind of those families? We have a narration of Sidhu's wife, the conflict she had, that her husband is going out, her family is going out. What will happen? Because she just wanted a family. But she also joins the revolution. So in a way that to bring those emotions out, to have a distinction out, so we thought a fiction narrative is better, but we have not stopped at that. From 1855, we come down to modern time. with someone from the same family, in same descendant, Santhal descendant in London, she doesn't know her past, and she has to be educated. So we just thought a fiction narrative would be better.
Now, Tuhin, you know, this is not your first book. Now, you've written about the great tribal warriors of Bharat. And you talk us about the tribal communities' contribution to this movement that led to, you know, what eventually was known as the 1857, the Great Rebellion.
So like I mentioned, Pranesh, tribal mutinies and tribal revolutions have been going on from 1784. In fact, even prior to that. But 1784 was the first reported, well-reported tribal revolution. Now, one thing which is very distinctive about these tribal movements, vis-a-vis the mainstream reported one, is that the British atrocities in tribal areas would be very layered. You know, because of very few British officers would venture into the hinterlands and would actually be stationed there for long periods of time. So what they did was that they figured out two devices through which they could outsource their atrocities upon the poor. So there were two components to these atrocities. One was the financial subjugation aspect. So, for example, even in the 1855 revolt, the build-up begins or the reasons begin in 1757 Battle of Plassey between Sirajuddaulah, the ruler of Bengal, and the East India Company. Now, obviously, every time the East India Company assumed the rule of a certain region, the first thing they would do is to increase the revenue targets upon the zamindars. The zamindars would subsequently start torturing the peasants and the landless laborers, or would make them landless by bringing in fresh legislation which would mean that, you know, even they would lose all holding rights over the property which belonged to them. But by 1850, around 1850, the Britishers realized that financial subjugation was not sufficient. So they unleashed another atrocity, which was cultural subjugation. They started planting missionaries from abroad. So in the region of present-day Ranchi and around, they planted some 100 German missionaries, and these German missionaries were given very clear targets. So in that sense, these subaltern...
That's a theme in the book, and while I'm sorry to interrupt you, I've made my notes. So, you know, you've also spoken about, I mean, the book details the conversion angle, how some British saw themselves as, you know, part of this civilizing ecosystem, and they thought that it is on them to do this on our land. How prevalent a factor was this in tribals perceiving this as a threat to their identity?
If you look at the period from 1784 right up till our independence, that period of subaltern revolts, of revolutions, could be broadly categorized into two categories. One is pre-1850, where only financial subjugation was the dominant factor, and post-1850, where the two factors converged, financial subjugation and cultural subjugation by way of conversions. So while Sido Kanhu's revolution is still largely centered around, you know, like when the war actually started, it was primarily against zamindars and moneylenders, who were acting as fronts for Britishers. And when I talk about moneylenders, the moneylenders were from nearby areas, like, you know, they would settle in those areas. They would be extremely unethical people. For example, if they would give out 1 anna for a month, they would sometimes charge 20, 30%, sometimes 40% interest per month. And because the Adivasis were completely illiterate, they could never calculate the figures. For them, the measuring system would be ek haath, do haath. Sometimes they would. So this was, you know, from something as trivial as this was something as trivial as this was the starting point of these disputes, leading to a situation where the entire community felt that till the time these money lenders are thrown out, these zamindars are thrown out. So when 1855 war started, they probably the perpetrators or the architects of this revolution had never imagined the might of the Britishers, because they very seldom had a direct interface with them. Simultaneously, the Britishers barely knew the tribal areas well, because very few of their officers. So I think, you know, this is a great example of a community-led movement. It was sporadic. It was, you know, it had different phases to it. For example, in the first phase, around the time that we are sitting here, 9th or 10th, I think that was the time when Sido got killed initially. So for a few weeks, the movement subsided. Then in another area, by word of mouth, a fresh revolution or fresh revolt erupted, and this went on for a good 8-9 months, leading to the formation of the Santhal Parganas district 1 year later, even though the legislation says that it was formed, it is the Santhal Parganas Act of 1855. So I think, you know, the impact of these revolts have been enormous, but they were discovered in hindsight, because while the tribal heroes were alive, they were seldom taken seriously, because history is always written from the point of view of
rulers. We'll talk about that also, but you was talking about
the conversions.
The cultural assault.
Yeah.
Conversion was part of it?
Yeah, so the cultural assault by the British has been the system across the planet during the colonial period. Like, I grew up in Africa, so Nigeria. So there also you would see the missionaries come into Africa in the history, try the conversion happen, break down the tribal system and all. So this is part of the, I would say, weaponization of a way to break civility, and so that people do not have their, if they forget their past identity, you can create a new identity and then control them. So as long as we have our independent thought process identity, then it helps in, it's very difficult to control. Now, in case of the Santhals, we have softly brought this point out, where the British officers were also keen to convert the locals, and in order to control them. So this part we have seen also. It's all part of power struggle.
Okay. Now, Tuhin, let's talk about the larger issue here. We're a nation of collective memories. I want you to talk about the Santhal insurrection, and why is it not part of our history? I mean, even if you were to Google about Sido and Kanhu, there is very little that has been written. And if you've seen Vikram Sampath's Brave Hearts of Bharat, his 2 parts biography on Savarkar, then Sanjeev Sanyal has come up with a book. So there is this now, a time when people are writing about unsung heroes.
So there are 2 reasons why they have been excluded from our course curriculum, or generally from our narrative. One is that, generally history has always been written from the point of view of rulers, But having said that, I think this colonial mindset should have been corrected maybe, 1 decade or 2 decades after our independence. We allowed it to prolong, we allowed this narrative to prolong itself for too long. This course correction, which began in 2014, should ideally have happened much before that. But another aspect which I would like to talk about now is that, when we started working on these books, it was a huge challenge to dig out primary sources of authentic information. Because it's a fact that during their lifetime, most of these people were seen as underdogs who could not impact history. But it's a fact that this revolt led to the formation of Santhal Parganas district, a separate, zone where, special care was taken to ensure that their land rights were protected in future. Birsa Munda's fight was against a missionary. His primary fight was against missionary. That was 45 years later. That missionary was Father Hoffman, a wily missionary who had certain targets for conversion, and that had led to a lot of social unrest. But look at the irony of it. While Birsa Munda died in 1900, a landmark Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act was introduced by the Britishers in 1908, 8 years after his death, and the person who was instrumental in getting that was the same Father Hoffman, because they realized in hindsight that if they don't become more accommodative towards the interests of the Adivasi population, there would be many more similar revolts. So all of these revolts were very impactful, but they were seldom known during the lifetime of these protagonists. One of the reasons why we don't have too much of primary information. And again, I read in one of the books around Whole Revolution that many of the British sepoys who were used to crush the 1855 revolt eventually got killed in 1857, as a result of which the primary sources of recordings or the jottings were gone.
Right. Now, Clark, the book is already getting rave reviews on social media. Are you also in talks with, are we going to see a film perhaps on, it was, OTT?
Yeah, so Birsa Munda was acquired, has been acquired by Viacom. We're still figuring out. There are budget issues. They wanted it to be the biggest serial, the 20 lakh budget daily. So we're still figuring that out. And obviously, we would want each of these books to be converted into cinema. Those talks are on, and let's see.
Now, while we were talking about the narrative, you know, do you believe the governments and successive governments at that in the past must answer why this was not documented, this was not part of the curriculum?
Well, ideally, like I mentioned, the course correction should have started in by 1960s or 1970s. But then, you know, I think the colonial mindset of our rulers, you know, extended itself for too long. So it's better late than never. But one, since, you know, you have asked a question about political narrative, you know, one of the reasons why the Naxal movement today has been decimated in the last 10 years is because of the sense of belongingness which the Adivasi population living in hinterlands now feels towards India and the government. And why is that? Because of basic, because of ending the disparities that were there. Simple government schemes like Jan Sedan Yojana, like Ujjwala scheme, like Swachh Bharat campaign, and more importantly now, the Nal Se Jal program has given them basic amenities, in the absence of which vested interests would convince them that India doesn't care, the state does not care for you, and then, you know, Naxal forces would take over.
Tuhin, are you saying that because you're, you know, part of the BJP?
No,
many would say that, you know, are you saying the previous governments didn't do anything?
No, no, it's a fact that in 2014, what was the sanitation cover? 39%? What is it now? So the data speaks for itself. If 35 crore fresh bank accounts have been opened, you can imagine that, you know, there was no financial inclusion. As a result of which, the same money lenders who were the wily money lenders, see, there is a nexus between the money lenders and the conversion mafia.
Right.
You know, they would all
always been a connection.
They would always work in tandem. So hasn't the inclusion of this population, this vast population in the formal banking structure ended or decimated the impact of money lenders? So these are, I mean, all of these things can be corroborated by data.
Now, there's one last thing that, you know, I want to highlight. The book talks about Charles Dickens. It's a prominent mention in the book. He has words of praise for the Santhals, and you've mentioned that. Yeah, Clark has that page open. But as you would know, you know, Dickens, for all his literary greatness, also called for extermination of all those who took part in the 1857 rebellion.
Yeah. Well, we had to take out the portions relevant in the book, but Suraj, that was Suraj's contribution, and Suraj would just share.
So, see, Dickens is part of the British Empire, so he would have to toe the line in a way. So the point which Charles Dickens brought in his magazine, Household Word, which came as an editorial, was this is an honourable enemy. Even though it is known that poison arrows are used for hunting, they never use poison arrows against the British soldiers, which shows there is honour. In fact, there were some places written that they're more honourable than the Russians. So in a way that Dickens was trying to praise the Santhals in terms of the way they behave themselves in battle. Because if you remember our old times, when we read our mythology and all, it was like when sunset happens, there's no battle has to stop.
Right.
So there were certain rules to warrior, like Geneva Convention. There's certain rules.
True.
Even after World War I, the poisonous gas was stopped. Ultimately, chemical weapons were stopped and all. So there's certain rules of human warfare. So Dickens will bring that for Santhals. I think that's very important point to think that yes, a story in an age of non-internet ship fare could reach from a small village to London.
So while he recognized their valor, he was also all praised for the virtue and the value that they had.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, you know, I want to thank both of you.
Let me just take 30 seconds. You know, in all this, let us acknowledge the role of Prime Minister Modi in bringing to the fore these subaltern warriors. I have grown up in a place called Jamshedpur, where I would often hear about Birsa Munda, because there is a Birsa Munda Chowk, there is a Birsa Nagar Basti and all. But whenever I would want to research or know more about these characters, there was a dearth of information. So when a Prime Minister, you know, repeatedly talks about invokes the contribution of these tribal leaders, that develops a curiosity, a national curiosity for others to follow up on that, and for writers like us to do our bit and contribute.
And I congratulate both of you for adding to that cause, and hopefully the book does well. All the best,
Thank you,
Tuhin and Clark, for this book. Thank you, viewers, for joining us on this special broadcast.